Hello, my name is Dr. Ansi Ramasamy and I'm from Victoria University. I'm a lecturer in management, and today we've got in the studio Professor Alan Nankervis from Curtin to talk about some of the challenges around human resource management in Australia. Hi Alan.
Hello Ansi, thank you for inviting me.
Thanks for coming in today. So we'll look at some of the questions around strategic HRM and some of the HRM practices. Is HRM becoming more strategic in Australian organisations, do you believe?
I think the theory is well ahead of the practice, particularly in smaller organisations. I think there's evidence from research that in larger organisations, particularly very large, that there is evidence that strategic HRM is being practiced in the sense that HR systems and HR processes are following the needs of the business strategy. In smaller organisations, I think it's not being so well adapted. Large organisations like BHP Billiton or like AMP or like some of the government departments are in fact, I think, adhering to the theory in their practice. But I think in the very small organisations and medium organisations, they either don't understand what the connection is between business practice and HR process, HR systems, or they feel they haven't got the time because they're too busy doing things to actually try and connect the outcomes of HR programs with the objectives of the business.
So what can realistically be done in these small organisations for them to adopt a more strategic mind frame to their HRM practices?
I think first of all they need to employ people who are knowledgeable about HRM and seriously recognise the relationship between staffing and recruitment and training and development, performance management and the business objectives. But I think they need to simplify it at a smaller level. If you're going to recruit people, you need to recruit people who are going to be good for the business at the SME level, both now and into the future. So flexible people, people who've got qualifications, people who are open to development, and nurture them in a fairly cost-effective kind of way. It's not that expensive to relate HR to the business, but it is important to recognise that if you have HR processes at whatever level, you can relate them to the outcomes you require of the business in terms of finance, in terms of cost effectiveness and so on.
What are some of the difficulties in measuring the contribution of HR to an organisation?
Probably the biggest problem is that HR practitioners themselves, if they exist in business, don't recognise the need to measure what they do. So measure the costs of recruitment, measure the cost of alternative ways of recruiting people, alternative labour markets, alternative sources of advertising for positions, and have an information system which is able to capture all the data, which will be able to convince managers that what they're doing is effective, is cost effective and is being accounted for.
What are some of the key environmental variables that you see changing in the business world today? And what impact do you think these changes will have in terms of, in the HR function of an organisation?
I think it's important to say that everything is changing. It's changing in terms of globalisation. In Australia, for example, most companies have some business interest offshore, and many offshore companies have a business interest here. So globalisation is happening, particularly regionalisation in Southeast Asia and Asia. Relationships with China, relationships with America, obviously now with the new president, are changing, and the nature of work is changing. You can think of any number of businesses which have actually changed over the last 10 years in terms of the use of technology, or actually changed the kind of jobs. Some reports recently indicate that the number of jobs and type of jobs will change completely in the next 10 to 20 years. So the nature of jobs are changing with technology. The nature of workplaces themselves are changing with the use of remote workers, people who work from home. Contracting, permanency is not very common now as a feature of work conditions. Many people work part-time or permanent part-time or casual or outsourced. If you ring up your telephone provider or your IT provider, most often you'll find that their call centres are based offshore. I have a friend in the Philippines who I talk to quite a lot about Telstra services. Nice guy. But obviously the jobs that are being done by those people are not being done by Australians. So the nature of jobs, the nature of workplaces, there's a significantly ageing population of which I'm a part, which means that over time the skills of that ageing population will disappear and maybe be replaced by new skills. Younger people are looking for different things, particularly in terms of work-life balance, looking for satisfaction in their jobs that perhaps their parents didn't have. So jobs themselves are changing, workplaces are changing, attitudes of aspirants to jobs are changing, the nature of HR is changing in response in terms of the use of new technologies, the use of new ways of recruiting people, new criteria for selection, new ways of training people, training packages online rather than face-to-face, saves costs, but also is more effective in many ways because the new workers coming on board in this new situation are looking for new ways of being trained. They don't want to be trained in a classroom. They want to be trained online, as example of blended learning that you're doing now. The students want to have a blend of face-to-face and online. The nature of performance management is changing. The expectations of performance are changing. Everything is changing. So in the next generation, you're going to be finding people who are looking only for 2 or 3 part-time jobs rather than a full-time job. And the kind of jobs are going to be changing, as you know, in every sector. Maybe university lecturers won't exist in 10 years' time. Certainly in my lifetime, the nature of university lecturing has changed considerably. Online courses are common these days. Overseas companies are offering university courses online completely. MOOCs, you've heard of MOOCs. Cheap, free, online across the world. So in our industry, things are changing, but in every other industry, look at things like travel and tourism. If I want to take a trip overseas, I'm not going to go to the local travel agent anymore. I'm going to go to some of the online hotel service providers and get a better deal. TripAdvisor, if I can mention a name, to look at a number of different options for going overseas. Travel, I can do my flights online. Things like florists. If I want to send a bouquet to you, for example, I'm not going to go down to the local florist shop. I'm going to go online and send you one from maybe overseas. And so the nature of the workers involved in these industries is changing immensely. People in call centres, people back of house who are doing the work that formerly was done from front of house. I spent a lot of time looking at hotels, living in them as well, but also looking at them from a research point of view. The nature of hotel work is changing. There are hotels in this city which don't involve or don't employ any full-time staff. There are hotels in the world, across the world, which have self-cleaning rooms. So everything is changing. IT is changing. And HR has to be responsive to that. Responsive in terms of new selection criteria, responsive in terms of new selection processes. Employers these days routinely use Facebook to pre-screen applicants. It can be a danger for students who are using Facebook for nefarious purposes. But they're also using LinkedIn to actually attract staff. So the whole nature of HR is changing. And even prospectively into the future, I'm thinking that maybe, this is something a bit innovative, I guess, that HR as an organisational discipline might disappear, be replaced by each individual worker being their own HR professional, negotiating with employers about salaries, negotiating with employers about training themselves. So there may not be an overall HR function at all in the future.
So what are the major occupational health and safety problems and HRM challenges related to occupational stress and bullying?
I think in the past, occupational health and safety at work was primarily concerned with manual problems, building sites, construction sites, hospitals, health sites where there were dangers of disease or toxins or actual physical damage. I think that's been extended now to stress of all kinds of stress at all levels in all kinds of occupations, and as you say, bullying, harassment, which most organisations have been addressing with policies and sometimes systems and processes, but a major issue that I think is solved, if it's solved at all, by education and by teaching supervisors how to handle staff without allowing bullying, without having to report bullying or deal with bullying. A major issue in many organisations.
And do you think organisations in Australia are actually up to date with their bullying practices?
Well, I think most organisations are aware that there's a legal issue involved in bullying and creating stress, and that creates compensation issues. I think they're probably aware of the legal issues, but they're probably, in some cases, not aware of the need to educate staff about preventing bullying and teach managers how to prevent and how to manage bullying. It's it's a legal focus, I think, at this stage. In the long term, it may well lead to educational approaches to address it, rather than just being purely legalistic.
And what are the HRM challenges related to flexible employment? And how can HRM mitigate these problems?
Flexible employment is becoming the norm in particularly large workplaces. And I think perhaps in smaller workplaces it's also a little bit easier to operate. The 9 to 5 routine day with no weekend work is no longer a reality, I think, in most workplaces. And given that, and given the fact that many employers encourage their employees to work from home, there is a degree of flexibility. And I think when I talked about employees being their own HR managers, I think there's an opportunity when they're being employed, if they've got the talent that employers are looking for, to negotiate work-life balance or work-family balance conditions. So I think it's getting better, and I think employers are recognising that it's a 24/7 world in many sectors, and accordingly we have to offer those opportunities where possible. There are some limitations to that, of course. An airline pilot, for example, can't just take their work home and do it from home. A bus driver can't really do remote work. But within the constraints of particular jobs, I think it's possible to allow people to have time off when their parent or an aged friend is not well, or their children have issues. And I think that's just reasonable management behaviour. It's not rocket science. I think it's more about recognising that your employees have personal lives as well as work lives, and to accommodate them, people will work weekends or work different hours without penalty rates if they feel that their employer is being reasonable with them in terms of their normal life behaviours. Illness is normal. Having children with problems is normal. Having ageing parents is normal. It's not unreasonable for the employer to think, well, we can give them some leeway. We can cover them sometimes when they have personal problems.
But how does that all fit within the workforce, the work casualisation trends you were talking about earlier?
Casualisation has benefits as well as disadvantages. Many disadvantages, but also some benefits. If we're moving towards a casualised world or a contract world, which is what I think we are in the workplace, then the contract has to be negotiated. And negotiations include, from the employee's point of view, the fact that they do have personal lives that they need to accommodate. And the employer will need in the future, if they want the talent to be retained, to enable that kind of work-life balance. So I think it's in the interest of both the worker and the employer. Some employers are not very far-sighted. Some employers are very far-sighted. Some of the big employers, some of the Googles and the HPs and so on, Microsoft, as you know, have very flexible workplaces. I don't think smaller companies can afford that kind of flexibility, but they can afford a degree of flexibility. When your mother is not well, you need to look after her. When your child has got the normal childhood problems, it's expected that you can take some time off work and someone will fill in for you.
How can organisations better attract and retain good staff in low-profile industries?
We've been doing some work on aged care, and particularly the career opportunities for personal care workers, which are the bulk of the workforce in aged care. I have a personal interest in this because in 10 years' time I'll be there myself, needing a very skilled aged care worker to look after my demands. And one of the problems of aged care workers is that baby boomers, such as myself, and Generation Y and Generation X thereafter are going to be quite demanding. My mother's generation would have put up with anything. In fact, she did in a nursing home. She'd just take what was given to her. But people like me, people like you, younger people are not going to put up with that. So it's going to be quite difficult to attract people into those positions. They're not very attractive positions at the moment. The pay is low. The conditions are not particularly good. It's very hard work emotionally as well as physically. It's very hard to develop a career, but there are things happening in terms of developing bachelor's degrees, for example, in aged care. Wollongong TAFE, for example, with which I'm associated, has a bachelor's degree in aged care management. So educating managers in aged care to recognise that their staff are doing very hard work under very difficult conditions, and providing them with resources and hopefully in the future, through federal government assistance, more money, more benefits. It's surprising in terms of my research that a lot of the people who work in aged care as personal care workers actually like being there. Unfortunately, the workforce is very skewed towards people in their 40s and upwards, maybe 50s and upwards, sometimes even more, who like the job, who accept the low pay and the relatively poor conditions. But I think in the future, because of people ageing, there are going to be a lot more people in nursing homes or in residential aged care who need these kind of workers. So it's going to be imperative for governments and for the homes themselves to attract people. And that means making the job more interesting, more flexible in terms of your earlier question, and more higher paid. It's going to take a long time to do that, but it's going to happen because the politicians who are cutting aged care at the moment will themselves be in aged care in the future. And so they'll be demanding themselves, as I will myself and my generation will, more complex positions, more skilled staff, more highly paid staff. It's not going to be easy, but it's going to have to happen because of demand from the community.
Do you think gender targets of quotas for senior management positions are a good idea?
Personally, I'm not in favour of quotas. What I think tends to happen from my personal experience with quotas, with women or with ethnic groups or with Indigenous people, is that they tend to be tokenistic. We want 50% women, so we recruit 50% women, or 50% Aborigines or 50% ethnic groups, and we get that quota filled, but not necessarily with the best people always. No, I think an alternative to quotas is having management recognise, and particularly senior management recognise, that it's good to have a diverse workforce. Good because the diverse workforce reflects the community which they serve. Good because customer service requires different approaches to different groups of people, different individuals. Good because diversity means that you have what I'd call a constructive, disruptive approach to decision making, where you get a whole lot of different views. For example, companies like PCW, PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Qantas, AMP, HP, Australia Post, to name but a few, are companies which are looking at consciously having a diverse policy and diverse community so as to reflect the people they serve, but also to make better decisions about the different groups that they represent. I know that PwC, for example, is consciously looking at breaking the bamboo ceiling. You know, the bamboo ceiling is where people of Asian descent get restricted, like the glass ceiling for women, from senior management positions. They're consciously breaking that because they recognise they're global companies. They're representing global markets, and particularly Asian markets. They need Asian managers with different sets of skills to local Australian managers to look for the interests of the people they serve. So I think, I've strayed a bit from the question, but I think that diversity is an important thing which is achieved more effectively through training managers, through educating companies and workers, and through more conscious steps to increase the number of people you recruit from different groups, not just women, not just Indigenous people, not just from ethnic communities, but from a whole range of different kinds of skills. And it may be short people. I've always argued from a personal interest perspective that tall people tend to get more jobs at leadership level than shorter people. Maybe it's good to have some shorter people.
To what extent do you think the skills and responsibilities of top paid CEOs in Australia justify their compensation packages?
I think you're referring to a recent issue with one of the CEOs at Australia Post. I think it's a genuine concern of employees and perhaps governments as well, that CEOs should probably not get paid more than the Prime Minister, or five times more than the Prime Minister, unless they're achieving outcomes for the organisation which can be seen as related to that. I think there'll be many studies of CEO pay, and most of them in Australia and elsewhere conclude that CEOs very often are paid too much, and their pay is not related to the performance of the company. In fact, the CEO of Qantas, when the company was making huge losses, was disproportionate to his performance. His subsequently repaired his performance and the company's doing well. And maybe in that case, there should be a relationship between CEO pay and his performance of the company. But I think there's a lot of genuine criticism of the fact that CEOs, in relation to their performance, are getting paid too much. And I think workers themselves feel that if CEOs are getting paid, particularly when companies are not doing particularly well, that there is a slur on their own performance because they're not getting paid anything like his for their performance. So I think there needs to be a balance between performance and rewards at both CEO level and also at worker level, that you should get paid for performance. And that performance should be clearly specified in the beginning. So if they're getting additional benefits which are not related to their actual outcomes, then I think that genuinely should be criticised. I think the whole point of strategic HRM is that HRM should be related to business performance, and HRM outcome should be related to business performance. I think in the case of rewards, the same should apply, the same principle should apply, that CEOs should be rewarded for their performance according to the company objectives, but perhaps not as much as in some cases they are currently paid.
And on a related note, what do you think of the practice of, the golden handshake, when CEOs are not performing very well, but still they're being paid huge amounts?
It's possibly an effective way of getting rid of people that you want to get rid of, that you can't otherwise easily terminate. And not everyone has Donald Trump's ability to say you're fired at the drop of a hat. So I don't approve of golden handshakes. But then there are also things like golden bracelets. Have you heard of golden bracelets? Where you've got a person who's particularly talented, who's being recruited or poached by other companies, and you give them a golden bracelet or a golden anklet to keep them rather than lose them. I think that's beneficial if you can justify the need for that particular skill or set of competencies.
Why is it important for organisations to conduct job analysis?
Because job descriptions, which are related to job outcomes, can only be prepared or agreed or contracted if you have clear ideas about what the job involves. And given that jobs these days are changing enormously, then I think every year or two you probably have to look at the job and analyse what are the components, have the skills changed, what technologies are being used now, what specific goals do you have for that particular job, and then you agree it with the incoming person or the incumbent to that job. So I think it allows for flexibility, but also provides some sort of parameters under which the job should be done and should be evaluated.
What are the effects of labour shortage, you think, on a few HRM practices? So the first one being selection and placement.
They need to, first of all, know what they're looking for. Secondly, they should be looking at where they're sourcing their labour or could be sourcing in the future, including alternative markets, which could be overseas. One of the things that I've talked about before is the ASEAN Economic Community, which started in late December 2015, which we don't hear very much about in the newspapers. But the ASEAN Economic Community, which is similar in purpose to the EU, is actually going to provide talent mobility or labour mobility across the ASEAN region, of which we're not a part. So if we're wanting to recruit globally with global skills and skills to be able to work in Southeast Asia, for example, we're not going to be able to compete with Indonesia or Taiwan or Singapore or Thailand or Vietnam, because there's talent mobility laws across those countries which don't extend to Australia. So in terms of selection, you need to look at what are you looking for, where do we think we should look for the kind of skills that we need into the future. Do we need university qualifications? Do we need international experience? What are the things that we actually need in terms of our future jobs? And where should we source them from? Should we source them from graduates? Should we source them from people who have work experience, or a combination of both those? I've recently been doing some work on graduate work readiness in Southeast Asia, 9 countries in Southeast Asia. All of them are having problems with recruiting graduates with work-ready skills or employability skills. In other words, they've got their qualification, everybody has these days, but they haven't got the competencies to actually work for the next 6 months in a job. So our employers are going to have to spend money to train them how to work, how to apply their skills to a work situation. So are we looking at people who have the skills now as employers? Are we looking at people who need to be trained with work skills which costs us 6 months training to get them ready to work? Or do we want something different? Do we want to recruit a mix of younger and older people? Do we want to retain people who have the skills, perhaps after retirement age? Or do we want to have a portfolio where older workers mentor younger workers? What combination do we want? Do we know what we want? Are we having the same old requirements that we've had for the last 10 years when technology is changing the nature of work? Are we looking for the same labour sources we always used, or are we looking for different ones? Are we looking for outsourcing opportunities, for example, rather than in the workplace, remote working? Are we looking for a combination of those kinds of things?
So what impact do you think would labour shortage have on employee learning and career development? For example, we're talking about, a lack of skill and skilled people. Do you think what kind of strategies organisations in terms of their learning and development can they actually implement to be able to, as you said before, attract and retain employees, which is kind of the key challenge in HRM at the moment?
Well, I think Generation Y, Generation X workers are looking for, from all the research that's been done, looking for opportunities to learn. And people who have done degrees without the appropriate employability competencies are also needing to learn. So I think employers need to provide opportunities of an ongoing nature for any employee who's coming on board these days, because they're all looking for developing their skills rather than having static skills. They want dynamic skills. So I think training and development is going to be an objective for both employers but also for the employees themselves. They're looking to develop their skills. They need to develop their skills as technology changes. So it's, I think, a shared responsibility of both employers and new employees.
What are some of the issues, major issues associated to downsizing, and how can the process be improved for the employer and the employee?
I think downsizing has become the epidemic of the 2000s, and I don't think it's going to stop. I think downsizing is the result very often of technology or financial mismanagement or globalisation, and it's not going to stop. So I think the trick, if there is a trick, is to plan it in ways which don't alienate employees or their unions where they exist, and to plan it in a way which provides employees with the best possible outcomes, that is to lose their job but to get the opportunity of other jobs through retraining. And I think it's not just employers here involved, also governments involved, and to do it in a way which is as best possible looking after the interests of employees who are going to be downsized, and also looking after survivors who fear that in the future they may well be downsized as well. And that's difficult to do. It's not easy, but I think it is through consultation, through retraining. If you look at some of the industries in Victoria, the power stations that have involved downsizing, governments have helped organisations to provide training for different jobs. Difficult when you're in your 60s, been working at a car factory for the last 30 years and don't have any skills. It's not easy to become a hospitality employee, but it is possible to discuss with employees prior to being downsized, what do you need from us in terms of compensation packages, training, retraining, liaison with other organisations, and that's a government responsibility as much as an employer responsibility, so that you can be retrained for another job, so you can get a job in hospitality. I remember years ago, Tasmanian logging industry was going to downsize a lot of their workers, burly, 6-foot, barrel-chested workers who'd been wood chipping for many, many years to become waiters in cafes. Not going to happen. So it's got to be a realistic planning for skills that people can do, or encouraging early retirement, which becomes a burden for the government, a burden for the community, and a burden for the workers themselves. But sometimes there's no possibility. But treating them well, because employers lose their reputations if they don't treat their employees well, even when downsizing. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but many times, like in the car industry, there was a plan to retrain people as practically as possible in jobs they could do in the future. So consultation, talking to unions where they're involved, training where possible, not just for how to approach an interview, but seriously looking at new skills. Old dogs, in some cases, can be trained. There are some new tricks. In some cases, they're not. But if they're not trainable or retrainable, then looking after their transition to retirement, looking after financial aspects as much as possible, planning ahead rather than just leaving it till many companies do Christmas Day or the day afterwards. You're sacked. That's not good for reputation, not good for business to do it that way, not good for the community as well.
What do you understand by the term diversity management, and why is it important for organisations to implement diversity management policies?
I think we've talked about it before. Diversity management, in my memory, was first mentioned in respect of women and the glass ceiling in particular. But I think it's become much more diverse over the years, starting with Indigenous people, then moving on to ethnic minorities, then moving on to now same-sex relationships. But I think it's broader than that. In a very positive sense, it's complementary to earlier anti-discrimination legislation. Anti-discrimination legislation was intended to prevent employers and other people from discriminating against people on the basis of some irrelevant characteristic like their age or their gender or their ethnicity. I think diversity management is more positive than that. Employers recognising that a diverse workforce means that they're getting a whole range of different skills that they wouldn't get from their traditional male workforce. Empathy, compassion, decision-making skills, problem-solving skills, communication skills in different languages or different communities, a whole range of things. So diversity is a very positive aspect, whereas anti-discrimination may have been seen as somewhat negative. But I think diversity is really important because it's a question of developing a workforce which has flexible skills in a global sense to cope with different kinds of marketplaces, different kinds of customer needs, different kinds of decision-making methods. So if you've got a whole lot of people with linguistic skills or cultural skills or communication skills and put them together and they're different, you create a very positive decision-making, problem-solving atmosphere because they contribute different kinds of skills. You don't get the clone effect. You get people who are thinking in different ways, and I think IT companies, I think communication companies, public service organisations benefit from having a diverse group of people, not just from those minority groups, but from different ways of thinking. They benefit themselves, they benefit their customers, they're more flexible. Our Prime Minister was talking about agility and flexibility. Agility and flexibility in companies, I think, comes from, at least in part, diversity. Thinking out of the box, thinking out of the circle, being disruptive so you can respond to the challenges of the future. So I think diversity management is something that many Australian companies now are embracing, talking about inclusion rather than exclusion, talking about, I think we mentioned before that CEOs recently sent a letter to the Prime Minister of many companies, 35 companies I think, saying we want to have same-sex marriage, not necessarily because it's a good social thing to do, but because it means that we can release people in same-sex relationships from being discriminated against. They can then contribute to the organisations, to the community. It's good for business, I think is what they were saying, and I'd agree with that.
And so you're saying that comes back to what I was going to ask about, whether Australian organisations are ready for such policies, and it appears that they are. They're actually taking a very proactive approach.
Those who are not are being forced into it because they're recognising that their customer base is changing, their workforce base is changing, they have to adapt to it. That means being maybe not complex, diverse policies, but being open to the fact that whether you're Indigenous or from a different ethnic group or a woman or a man or a short person or whatever, or gay, that you can contribute because of your personality, because of your skills, because of your diversity, in a sense. So I think maybe smaller companies take longer to come to the party, but I think larger companies certainly are expressing that now in ways that they didn't before. So it would be only realistic to expect that companies in the future who want to compete globally have to recognise that diversity is an important part of that.
And what are some of the issues in the workplace you think can inhibit effectiveness of some of the, initiatives around diversity management?
Old attitudes, rigid processes, people who are willing to change, which can be a large proportion of some workplaces, resistance to political correctness. We've seen this in Brexit, we've seen this in Donald Trump across the world. Political correctness is seen as something restrictive rather than something which is supportive of change. Basically old attitudes, time we got past them. I think younger people don't have the same sorts of rigidity of thinking that maybe some of their older counterparts do, but not all older employees are rigid either, prepared to change. So I think we've got to cast aside this idea that we're living in a traditional world with processes and organisations and workplaces that operate the same way they have for the last 50 years. We're not. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution, which I think you've heard of, which is that we're continually changing through technology and everything is changing, and that means managers have to change. Managers require more training, better selection maybe. Teams require to work together and be more consultative, using different methods. All those kinds of things I think are important.
So does that mean we need to rethink our, composition of the senior management team as well?
I think so, yes, I'd agree with that. And certainly the selection criteria and the training that they undergo and the ways they communicate, all those things need to change.
And in what ways can the results of diversity management be measured, do you think?
You can do it in terms of quotas, you can do it in terms of recording how many people from different groups you employ, but I don't think that's a long-term measure. I think you look at what you intended to do, what goals you have for change, whether they've been achieved, and whether it's been assisted by having a different group of people working together. But it's not easy to do that. It's not hard to say, well, we had a diversity program and therefore we've got whatever. I was listening yesterday to a program on Radio National, I think, where they were talking about an Indigenous program at the ABC. And they do have the numbers on how many Indigenous people they've recruited and how many Indigenous people are appearing on TV as opposed to the past. But I don't think that tells the story. I think you've got to ask the workforce, maybe through morale surveys or climate surveys, do you think the situation has changed? Are we making better decisions? Are we involving people more? Are we including people more? It becomes a perceptual analysis rather than something quantitative, I think. I mean, you can have an organisation with 90% people from different ethnic groups. What does that prove? Nothing. It satisfies statistics. You don't get named in Parliament, but it doesn't actually prove that you've changed things. It's whether your decisions are getting better, whether your customers are being treated better, whether your services are higher quality, more responsive to a diverse community. It's hard to measure. I think it's important to try and measure where you can.
And what actions can employers undertake to manage mature workers more effectively?
Treat them well, recognise their skills, recognise that mature workers are workers with experience in dealing with customers, dealing with people. Can they offer mentoring ability to younger staff? Are they maybe losing it in some cases and should be encouraged to leave or retrain for something else? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by mature in a sense that some people are young and mature and some people are old and foolish. And when you say mature workforce, you mean people who are approaching retirement age or after. Some companies encourage people to stay as long as they can and want because their skills are still there. I think you've got to look at both sides, that maybe older workers, mature workers if you like, don't have the skills anymore, can't cope with technology. But it's interesting to note that some research has been done in nursing homes that the use of the internet is relatively high in nursing homes. People over the age of 80 who are learning to use computers and use it quite frequently. On the other hand, there are workers in employment who still don't use the internet or use computers or feel comfortable with technology. So I think you've got to balance it, that some mature workers are experienced and flexible, some are not. And the ones who are not maybe have to be downsized. There's a balance there. But I think you need to have a portfolio mix of younger staff and more mature staff. And that's a good synergy, because you've got people who have a lot of experience but are very rigid, and you have young people with no experience who are also very rigid. But older people who are flexible and supportive can encourage younger people who are willing to learn. So I think the mix is good. Not everybody who's 65 is past it, but not everybody who's 65 isn't past it either. I think there's a mixture there.
Why do you think a manager might intentionally distort appraisal results? And what would you recommend to minimize this?
Because they want to look good. And so if all their team are performing well, then they're performing well. Or because of bias, because they like a particular worker and they want to promote them. Or out of fear. Performance appraisals are feared routinely by managers and the people they appraise, because it's judgment. I'm making judgment about you and your performance. And I don't want to appear to be a nasty guy, so I give you a good performance rating when it's not good. What can be done? More objective measures, more regular appraisals. You know, I'm a person who does believe in performance reviews, because I think there's no alternative. But I think performance reviews don't have to be once a year. They can be every day, and they can be very informal, and informal is better. Informal supportive developmental focus is much better than once a year critical focus. So if it's once a year critical focus, then managers either tend to be very harsh or they tend to be very soft, most often soft, because it reflects on them and because they don't want to be judgmental. But I think if you do it every day with the intention of developing skills rather than once a year with the idea of criticising or sacking people, it's going to be much more effective.
And do you think it's reasonable for organisations to monitor the use of internet and email by employees?
Yes, in the sense that every time I clock onto my computer, my employer warns me that I shouldn't be viewing pornographic material or doing illegal things on the internet. So if I want to do that, go back to Google and do it there. I think that's reasonable for an employer to do that to employees, and if necessary, although I'm not in favour of sack people who do access it during work time. I think that's their right. In terms of monitoring behaviour, every time I call up Telstra or another agency, I get a message saying this call is going to be monitored for training purposes. Not sure what that means, and I think it probably intimidates the people who are being working in the call centre. But I think to a limited extent and with permission, there should be no reason why internet at work is not monitored. It's the question of why you're monitoring it. Are you doing it because you don't trust your staff? Are you doing it for legal reasons? Are you doing it because that's the way you monitor performance? And certainly in call centres that happens, and it's quantitative rather than qualitative assessment. If that's the contract that people enter into, I guess that's okay. I can see potential for malicious monitoring, particularly people who use email for their own purposes. I don't think that's necessary. I think it's quite reasonable for employees, including myself, to use my email for personal purposes as well as work purposes. If I'm consistently on Facebook at work, I guess that's a reason why employers can perhaps challenge me for, maybe not dismiss me, but challenge me for it and say, well, it's expected when you're at work, you're working for us rather than doing your personal things. I've seen instances where people spend most of their time on Facebook at work, which I think is unreasonable. But a reasonable amount of personal email use, I think is okay. It depends on the position, I suppose. I think professionals would object to having their internet activity being closely monitored, and it's probably not necessary. If you trust your staff, then I guess your staff will behave accordingly. So I think it's a mixed sort of question that there are some reasons why internet might be monitored, and in some positions that might be the only way of monitoring people, particularly remote workers. Some interesting research on remote workers suggests that remote workers actually work harder than people in the office because they get up in their pyjamas in the morning, and this has been monitored also over the internet, get up in their pyjamas in the morning and work all day and work all night, rather than 9 to 5 as they might in the office. So I think there's some benefits of that, and remote monitoring is perhaps the only way of monitoring their performance. But if it's done with a malicious intent, I think it's probably not helpful, because it's just another element of lack of trust between employer and the employee.
Why should organisations implement learning and development programs?
I think if you recognise that workplaces are changing, that job skills are constantly redeveloping, you need to have some kind of ongoing training and development program. I think there's also an expectation from younger workers these days that they do get access to learning and development. Some of it's their own responsibility, but some of it certainly, if you want your employees to be current, is the employer's responsibility. And I think you get benefits as an organisation from employees being constantly trained. They're more satisfied, they're more productive, you get more return on investment, depending on the training. I've got some doubts about online training. It's a very cost-effective way of teaching people, but depending on how it's done, it can be just a routine ticking of the box exercise. I'll give you an example of that. I did some voluntary work for an agency and my partner as well, and I completed the occupational health and safety training course for both of us online, and after 3 attempts passed on for both of us, which meant that I just played a game with the system and won, but it had no real impact on my learning or my partner's learning, because we just done the exercise routinely. That kind of training I think is worthless. I think you need to have blended learning, some online and some face-to-face, and meaningful training and development rather than just ticking boxes. But I think a lot of organisations are tending towards compliance rather than actual development by having courses which you can do easily, don't involve classrooms, and you get a tick in the box, you get a certificate, but you don't actually learn anything. So I think employers need to think about what kind of training and development do we need, what's the best way of using that training and development, what are the outcomes we want, and can we evaluate whether the outcomes have been achieved or not. Because too often, you see at the end of the financial year, companies are spending their training budget on irrelevant things that they don't really need just to spend the budget. That's pointless. But I think it's important to identify what outcomes you want from training and development, identify the methods that are best available to transfer that knowledge, and then evaluating, did you achieve it? And do the employees have the skills? If you're doing that, I think that's strategic HRM.
And do you think that it's possible to train people in acquiring people management skills?
You do it all the time. I do it. I used to do it all the time. I think it is, yes. I think, but you've got to convince them of the need first of all, and also identify what kind of people management skills are most appropriate for their job and their organisation, and train them specifically in that. I think it's probably the fundamental dilemma for management is that senior management, middle management, line management is all about managing people. You promote engineers to become managers who have no people management skills. You promote doctors in hospitals because they're doctors to become CEOs whose main responsibility is managing people without training them how to do it. You, in universities, my apologies, have academics whose main skills are research and teaching becoming vice-chancellors without necessarily, I'm sure VUVC has very great people management skills, but there are many examples of people in those positions who don't have great people management skills. But what you're doing all day at that level is managing people. Some people have a natural ability, many people don't, and I think there are skills that can be transferred which are very valuable. Most employees who leave organisations say that the reason they left is because their manager didn't know how to manage people. So I think when an engineer gets promoted or an academic gets promoted, the thing that they're doing the rest of their life as a manager is managing people. So I think you need to find ways of transferring those skills. Otherwise, the whole organisation is going to suffer, because managers at all levels spend all their time managing problems, managing people, managing conflicts, managing teams. If you can't teach that and they can't learn those skills, then there's not much hope for the rest of us, really, is there?